Welcome back to the program. We are joined again by Colonel Douglas Macgregor, a combat veteran, author of many books on military strategy, and also a former senior advisor to the U.S. Secretary of Defense. So thank you very much for coming back on the program.
Well, thank you, Glenn. I appreciate it.
So when Trump, after spending his campaign talking about the folly of expanding NATO, in February we learned that there should be no NATO, no security guarantees, and Ukraine had to accept territorial concessions. Then he went back, argued for an unconditional ceasefire. He meant Putin meets in Alaska. Suddenly, he recognizes ceasefire is not peace after all, and he wants to also address the underlying causes, as he had referenced during his campaign. Now we're yet again back to ceasefire, and likely there will be no meeting in Budapest. So, what is actually happening here? This is starting to feel less like 4D chess and more like a ridiculous reality show where everyone is being kept on their toes the whole time. How do you make sense of this?
Well, clearly he's not the president of peace. He's the president of perpetual confusion. He tends to vacillate between two poles on every subject. So it's very difficult to follow the man, as you've already pointed to all of the contradictions. But at this particular point in time, I think we have to come to the realization that he's certainly not interested in ending the conflict in Ukraine any longer. If anything, he's turned away from it, and he's made rather strident outcome. We know that a ceasefire is just that, a ceasefire. It's temporary. Now, can you have temporary armistices that last 20 or 30 years? I suppose you can. We've had that in Korea. But I don't think that's the solution that Europe or most Europeans want in Ukraine. I think they'd like to see an end to the fighting. But to get there, you have to sign on for a strategic arrangement with Russia that codifies Russia's relationship with the rest of Europe. That's something that he should welcome, in my judgment. That would be a serious matter that constitutes an enduring legacy, if you will. But I don't see any evidence that he's interested in any enduring legacy. He still seems to be in the hunt for anything that he can quote unquote call a win. You know, I met with President Putin. I charmed him. He made a deal. We got a ceasefire. Peace is breaking out. Where's my Nobel Peace Prize? Unless he can say something like that, he's not terribly interested. It's an unfortunate set of circumstances, and I don't think there's any understanding at all right now of what Russia will do next. I think we see evidence right now already down in Kherson. The Russians have now established a bridgehead across the Dnieper River. I think we're going to see more Russian forces cross that river down south. I've always thought that they would want to retake Odessa, which historically is a Russian city, has nothing to do with Ukraine. It was still a Russian-speaking city when the Ukrainians drove its Russian population and Russian speakers out back in 2014. So I think that's on the menu. I would be very surprised if we didn't see something similar happen with Kharkov. And we see, near Liman and Slovyansk, ongoing Russian advances. So I think President Putin has held his council of war and said, fine, there's no reason for us any longer to exercise restraint on the ground. We'll press ahead. That's unfortunate. At the same time, he's turning his attention increasingly to Venezuela. And he pretends that the ceasefire in Gaza is some sort of a permanent outcome. There's no evidence for that. And I don't know what we're going to see happen in Gaza, although I think with the arrival of Kushner and Witkoff, the real estate oligarchs, we can look forward to some attempt to at least take 50% of Gaza and turn it into some sort of Israeli Disney World of real estate expansion. The whole thing is bizarre, and no one that I know that's serious at all about Venezuela has figured out why we want to go into Venezuela and enact suddenly out of nowhere regime change. And again, this was something that you mentioned earlier. President Trump had railed against regime change, as a pointless and self-defeating. All of a sudden, he's in the forefront of demanding it in Venezuela, of all places. Now there's talk about Colombia. I don't know. Perhaps he's going to go to Congress and ask for a declaration of war, although I doubt it.
Seems like a good way of getting millions of refugees yet again on the march north, though. It's again, looks like a lot of self-harm. But on, I think you're right, though, with the Russians. They seem to be stepping it up now a bit, also with this seemingly determination to turn off all the lights across Ukraine. But you do see that, well, we now see that the British used the Storm Shadow to attack a chemical plant in Bryansk. A few days ago, we got a report from Russian intelligence, FSB, that the attack on their nuclear deterrent, that the British were behind this. And, so there's more and more talk about direct war. We indeed saw the Europeans, they got quite excited when it sounded like Trump might send Tomahawks, which would be operated by American contractors, and they could carry nuclear warheads. And yet this was, Christmas time almost across European capitals. And of course, now Trump is putting sanctions on Russian oil companies, which even Biden didn't want to do. I mean, do you see this, the threat of a direct war looming, or do you see any indications that the Russians or others are preparing for it? Or is it
Well,
rhetoric?
I think he's reconsidered the wisdom of sending the Tomahawks. As you point out, mission planning and execution is entirely in the hands of Americans. That means Americans on the ground somewhere west of the Dnieper River launching Tomahawk missiles into Russia. I think he thought, well, this is probably not a good idea, and indeed it's a very bad idea. But there was something else. And I think there's been a sudden realization that our resources are not limitless. One of the few coherent moments that I've heard from him is where he talked specifically about the numbers of weapons and munitions and resources on the military side that we need for our own defense, and that we've poured about as much as we possibly can into Ukraine. Now, that may explain the sudden use of the Storm Shadow by the British. Who knows? The British, specifically MI6, and selected elements of the British military establishment have been in Ukraine from the very beginning and are into this war up till their necks. I don't know what the Russians plan to do in the future, but I would not be surprised to see some serious action taken against the British. The place, the timing, I can't anticipate that. I just don't know. But at some point, I think the Russians are annoyed. Remember, the Russians know that the British have very, very small armed forces. The British have bankrupted themselves. They're overspent. They could perhaps ship 20, 30,000 troops, to Russia or to Poland. That's about it. I don't see any evidence that they're going to implement national service and try to draft people to go fight in Ukraine. Situation in France is about the same, and France is even more volatile internally than Great Britain is. I don't think the French want to let the army go for fear that things could come unglued in France. So we've got lots of sort of empty threats coming from the Europeans. The Russians know that. And I think as a result, the Russians will continue to exercise restraint, but at the same time, they're going to move forward in Ukraine because, contrary to what a lot of people think, they'd actually like to see this war end. They don't really want to govern Western Ukraine. That would be a catastrophe for them. They know the population there doesn't want them, and they don't want that population inside Russia. They're really only interested in other Russians, people that are speaking Russian that want to be part of Russia being under Russian control. But every time I or anybody else who knows anything about Russia says this, we're silenced. We're told, no, you're wrong. He wants to conquer Europe. And of course, that would require universal service and national mobilization. Now, here's something that people in the West don't get. The Russians can do that. They can mobilize Russia for total war. They don't want to, but they can be done. And people think, oh, well, if we push them to mobilize for all-out war against us, once again, this will fatally weaken the Putin government, and he will be overthrown. So it's just a sort of repetition of stupidity and lies over and over and over again. But in the meantime, I think we're going to see the Russians press forward to the river. I think they're going to cross down in the south. I'd be very surprised if they don't move closer and closer to Kiev, and at some point act against the government that's in Kiev. But, the Russians have tried to avoid this. They've tried to find some sort of middle ground that was acceptable. But if we're not willing to listen, what's the point? And I'm afraid in the final analysis, that turned out to be the case with Trump. So Trump is now Biden, too, as far as the Russia is concerned, only, as you pointed out, with the oil sanctions, maybe worse.
It's also well, I guess if he really wanted peace, he would have to divorce himself a little bit from the delusion that he's merely, a peacemaker, a third party mediator, because I'm expecting to hear some talk about NATO if we're gonna see the end of this war. But he does seem almost as if he convinced himself that this is simply a Russia-Ukraine war, and it's about territory. And he's the guy on the side just trying to get these two countries with ancient hatred to come together. I mean, it's quite extraordinary. But you mentioned before Venezuela, but now that the war on Russia is again, it's become now Trump's war. We have now a possible second war against Iran, also on Trump's initiative, possible war with Venezuela. The Gaza peace hardly seems as it's going to hold. How are Americans reacting to this, his base? Because, is Trump with the globalist? I mean, where is America first now? Sorry, that was a lot of questions.
Well, before we leave Russia and that subject, I think we should point to what looks like increasingly a civil war inside the European Union and NATO. We have these explosions, and I'm not sure what they've destroyed or whether or not they're all real, but there have been explosions on the ground, I'm told, in Romania. Whether or not there was an explosion on the ground in connection with the Druzhba pipeline that supplies oil to Hungary, I don't know. Now you have a war of words between the government in Warsaw that is condemning the government in Budapest, as well as the government in Bratislava, for being, quote unquote, bad allies. In other words, refusing to join the anti-war crusade, anti-Russian crusade. I think this is much more serious than people realize. Yeah, the Slovenes have now banned Netanyahu from coming to Slovenia. That's the first nation in the EU to do that. I think we're seeing various states in the EU and inside NATO, many of them are in both, that are saying that they don't want to be part of this developing war with Russia. They don't want to be part of the tragedy in Gaza, and they don't want really anymore a close military alliance with the United States. Now, I don't think they're saying all of that publicly, but I think that's developing. It's probably long overdue. I felt for a long time that NATO should have gone out of business as a U.S.-led military alliance back in the early 90s. But that didn't happen, and we've been dragging various European states into and out of various countries ever since in various forms of conflict. But I think we need to take note of the fact that this spat, particularly between Hungary and Poland, is very significant. We need to look at Orban's response and Poland's accusations or allegations, because the Poles and the Hungarians really have a long history of cooperation, essentially good relations. And so for this to be as ugly as it is becoming right now between the Poles and the Hungarians, I think sets Europe up for further fragmentation and disintegration over an issue that really shouldn't have that kind of impact. But nevertheless, we're there. So I don't think Americans know about this. I don't think they really care because they don't understand European politics. But if I were living inside Europe right now, I would be very concerned about that.
Well, if I can add, I'm not sure all Europeans are aware of this either, because I saw the same reports that on the 20th of October, you had the explosion at a refinery in Hungary that's processing Russian oil. And within a few hours, there was an explosion at a Romanian refinery, also processing Russian oil. And then a day or two later, you had a similar explosion in a refinery in Slovakia, also refining Russian oil. Again, but I'm looking around the media, there's hardly any mention of it at all. I mean, it disappeared into a memory hole, a bit like Nord Stream. And and that this happens at the same time as you said, the Hungarians are now criticizing Poland, because Poland is going out very openly saying it's quite legitimate to attack the energy infrastructure of the occupier, even if that energy infrastructure feeds the Europeans as well. And of course, the Polish are also saying they don't want to hand over any suspects which destroyed Nord Stream to the Germans. They said the Germans should be ashamed for even building the Nord Stream to begin with. This is quite a radical rhetoric. So it looks like the Europeans are also turning on each other. I mean, the reason why the media probably has zero interest in is because it's obviously not Russia, which means that we're now either being attacked by the Ukrainians or we're attacking each other. But either way, there's no good narrative. So it just seems to have gone under the radar.
Yeah, I didn't expect Americans to pick up on it or understand it, but I am surprised at what you're telling me. I assumed, and I have not seen the press releases, but I have assumed that there would be far more coverage in Europe, apparently, than there has been. But the key thing for me is this sort of growing divide inside the EU and NATO between the states that have said this is ridiculous. We don't feel threatened by Russia. It's time to get on with our lives and put an end to this business, versus those who seem to be dedicated or devoted perpetually to hostility toward Russia. And Poland, back in 1999, when we brought Poland into NATO, lots of discussions behind the scenes by people, and I'm talking about Europeans. Americans never even raised the subject, but my European colleagues, particularly in the German and French forces, to a lesser extent the British, did bring up the issue of, is it wise to bring in Poland with its long history of hostility and enmity towards Russia? Are we asking for trouble down the line? Of course, at that point, there was no thought of Ukraine joining NATO. In fact, the joke, not really a joke, but the flippant remark was Ukraine's main mission is to stay neutral and put hundreds of miles between NATO and the Russian military, which most of us at the time thought was eminently reasonable. But apparently that attitude changed very rapidly. By the time you get to the Budapest Memorandum and so forth, you see that we're dealing now with a direct assault on Russia. So we've gotten the assault on Russia. It failed miserably. Ukraine is falling apart. It lives on the edge of collapse, political, military, and economic. It's almost to the point of Ukraine is a comatose patient lying on a slab, just outside the morgue. And people keep pumping adrenaline into it to keep it alive so that the heart beats and it appears to be capable, but it's not. It's finished. And all you have to do is ask the Germans that are living in places like Cologne or Dusseldorf, where are all the Ukrainian men? Well, they're all there. They're not in Ukraine ready to fight anybody, and more are trying to get out. The whole thing is a tragedy, but the governments in London, Berlin, and Paris and Warsaw won't let it go. So I don't know where it leads. In the meantime, as we talked before, we're now focused on Venezuela. And I think more Americans are interested in that for obvious reasons. It's closer to home. And they fall into two camps. You have what I call the Bombs Away Club. The Bombs Away Club consists of almost a third of the population that if you tell them we're bombing somebody somewhere, they're enthusiastic because they're convinced that when we're bombing someone, we're demonstrating our greatness and our power. The other, I would say, 60 to 70% of the population is uncomfortable because even the least well-informed American is asking, why Venezuela? Drugs? Really? The drugs that we're concerned about, the cocaine, comes out of Colombia. Now, some of it is ultimately filtered through Venezuela, no doubt about it, but not very many amounts. Colombia and Ecuador, those are the two big hubs. And Mexico is the Mexican cartels who are shipping the fentanyl north. And that comes from China to Mexico. Well, I guess people have decided you can't attack China. That's too risky. So let's drop that idea for the moment and let's attack someone in South America. And I think the combination of the illusory drugs with the real concrete interest down there, which is in oil, gas, emeralds, gold, has trumped everything else. So we're sinking fishing boats, we're sinking, fast boats, whatever we can find on the grounds that they're all drug smugglers, but they're not. And we're working very, very hard to create a conflict with Venezuela. I'm sure somebody in the CIA is trying to get somebody in the Venezuelan military to pull the trigger and launch a missile at us so that we can get on with this. It really looks a lot like Vietnam in 1965 and the whole Bay of Pigs, or not, excuse me, not Bay of Pigs, but um, the Gulf of Tonkin situation, where there was no attack. We fabricated the idea of one to justify intervening in Vietnam, which we wanted to do anyway. And, the sad truth is that when the first forces landed in Vietnam, they had no idea what they were supposed to do. And people on the ground finally made up their minds to attack objectives based on the alleged presence of Viet Cong in in certain locations. They had to get the war started somehow. So I'm beginning to see an awful lot of that with Venezuela. And I remember that I heard this once personally in my life, but I know that it happened earlier in 1965. The goal is to get the army into Vietnam. That was the goal. Before you did anything else, we've got to get the army into Vietnam. And Wolfowitz made the comment, we've got to get the army into Iraq. This is 2003. So we have the same mentality right now. How do we get ourselves into Venezuela? That's what we want to do. No one is thinking carefully through the various implications. Do we make ourselves responsible for the Venezuelan people? If we're going to dismantle the government and install a puppet, how do we keep the puppet in power? Does Venezuela then become this sort of international cause for Latin America to fight us? Will hundreds of thousands of paramilitaries from Colombia, Brazil pour over the border into Venezuela to fight us? And oh, by the way, why are we bailing out Argentina with hundreds, with enormous sums of money, and at the same time we're devoted to attacking Venezuela to presumably gain control of its resources? These are all contradictions that are swimming around people's heads in the United States, but no one has a definitive answer. But it is interesting to see. I listened yesterday to Richard Haass from the Council on Foreign Relations, and he's a prominent voice for intervention, military power, the use of it. And he's part of that broader club. I don't know what you call them now. That we used to call them neoconservatives, neocons, increasingly globalists, Zionists. I don't know what you call the group, but they're all in it. He's a prominent spokesman, and he says, "Oh yes, I strongly support regime change in Venezuela." Most of us heard that and sort of said, "What? Where has this come from? What's the point? How do we benefit from this? How do they benefit from it?" Not that anybody really cares, but if you're going to attack a country, unless you want to take permanent control of it and pay for it for the rest of your adult life, what are you doing about it? I mean, it's a bizarre set of circumstances. There is no rationale, at least no strategic rationale for any of this stuff, as far as I can tell. And we mentioned Gaza. That's an illusion. The war there is absolutely not over, and it's not going to end anytime soon.
Well, it looks like the Norwegians were giving Trump a bit of a layup, though, with the invasion of Venezuela with the Nobel Peace Prize, because the Norwegians gave the Nobel Peace Prize, as you know, to Machado, who, I mean, who's been pretty much advocating for not just sanctions, but now also military intervention, at least implicitly. And I guess it makes sense in terms of what happened over the past 30 years, how we think about peace under the democratic peace theory, because now we say peace requires democracy, and democracy can be delivered through war. So literally, war is peace now. So we see the Peace Prize winner on TV with Donald Trump Jr., and she's trying to convince him about how they don't need Saudi Arabia. Venezuela has even more oil, and we would love to privatize it if you just topple the regime. And yeah, I guess supposedly she would take power. It's quite obscene to watch, but
Well,
this is
she sounds like a Venezuelan version of Quisling.
very much. Yeah, we remember him.
Well, yeah, I don't think so, because if they had any memory of that, they would certainly question the wisdom of imputing all of this credibility to Machado. It's really quite amazing. Guaido, or whatever his name was a few years ago, was the celebrity that was supposed to be installed in Venezuela. There was an attempt to put him in there. The CIA was involved. It all failed and fell apart. And I think President Trump may believe that the way it'll work this time is with the active intervention of U.S. military power. And I think perhaps he's being told by his advisors, particularly the people in the Intelligence Committee, the Bay of Pigs failed in Cuba because the U.S. military was not part of it. Too much reliance was placed on people from Cuba returning to make it all work. I don't know. I'm speculating, but I'm trying to figure out in my mind what would lead the president to this. Because remember, the president spoke very clearly, very publicly, and said that Maduro had offered him, quote unquote, everything. Maduro's talked about a stake in Venezuelan resources and its oil and its gas. And he said he offered everything. That's true. Apparently, everything is not good enough. So we've gone from a state of mind in the United States that, at least until the last 60, 70 years, was war is the last resort, to the notion that the war is the best resort and the first resort. Why waste time on diplomacy? Why waste time compromising? Why waste time making agreements that allow you to share in resources and wealth when you can simply march in and take them? I guess, again, that's somewhat Norwegian, is it not? Sounds like the Vikings. We might as well sail down there, land, and take what we want. I'm being facetious.
Yeah. Well, we have a similar issues in Europe, though. That is, I spoke to a French general earlier today, and he kind of had a similar point. That is, he was making the argument that a lot of Europe's troubles are internal, but instead, all our focus is on Russia, which is being blamed for everything. But overall, within Europe now, we're having deindustrialization, debt, we have social and cultural fragmentation, crisis of political legitimacy, we have loss of traditional values. You can add demographic decline, free speech isn't doing too well, complete absence of digital and technological sovereignty. We started stealing Russian assets, seizing Chinese companies, essentially becoming rogue in the eyes of much of the world, and losing our relevance. Yet, the only thing our politicians talk about is war, and a bit more war against Russia, despite not having the weapons to win any such war, not having the money or the political will and support. So I feel, yeah, the political scientist at some point should be replaced by psychologists, because it doesn't really make much sense. But do you see any historical parallels here? Because
Well, I think you
the
could
worse we
probably,
do, the more we beat our chest, it seems.
well, I think to some extent you could go to Paul Kennedy's Rise and Fall of the Great Powers. And in his book, he talks in terms of what some of us call late stage empire behavior. This is when an empire is clearly, or a large power of some kind, we'll just say empire for the simplicity purposes, it begins to strike out in various directions externally in the hopes of sort of buttressing the walls against collapse. Britain after World War I tried to cash in on what it thought were the imperial gains that it had made as a result of defeating Germany. Austria, of course, had no colonies in Africa and other places like that, but the Germans did have some colonies, and the British eagerly absorbed those. But they went a step further inside the Ottoman Empire after creating these sort of artificial states that we are still living with, Jordan, Iraq, and so forth. They went into Iraq and they started pressing north because they thought they could probably get control of even more territory. And then they ran into a resurgent Turkish army that soundly defeated them and scared them. And so they backed off. And that's how you got the current border for southern Turkey with Iraq. However, after about 6 to 12 months in Iraq, they decided it was more trouble than it was worth because it was costing the British more to stay in Iraq and govern the place and try to run it and take its oil, which was the real purpose, obviously, than their national health budget. In other words, they were spending more in Iraq on the Iraqi state that they created to get the oil than they were spending on the national health budget. And suddenly people began asking questions. Why are we spending more there than we are here at home on the national health budget? And so there are some interesting exchanges of letters between Churchill and Lloyd George. And finally, Churchill says, we might as well get out of here. This is a bust. Let's leave. I think that's late stage empire behavior. In other words, you grasp for whatever you can get to demonstrate your power and to justify your existence and the status quo at home. So I think that's really what this is about. When I look at London and Paris and Berlin, and you look at the terrible potential for unrest and instability in all those countries right now, because of millions of people in those countries that were allowed to enter that had no intention of assimilating ever and will never assimilate. The only thing they can do is present an existential threat inside those societies to the existence of the societies that we know in those countries, their culture, their national identity, their way of life. So how do you distract people from that threat? I think Russia is a useful distraction. There's no question about it. And to a lesser extent, what's happening in the Middle East. Because again, if you're faltering economically in Great Britain and France, what do you turn to? Well, you'd like to see Iran balkanized and lose control of its oil and gas resources. You'd like to find a way to divert all of that in a way that's going to make you a great deal of money and replenish your capital stocks. I think that's going on in Paris and London. As far as Berlin is concerned, that's anybody's guess. They seem to have made a suicide pact with the world and said, to be good Germans, we will destroy ourselves, and then we will be worthy of you and your love and affection. I mean, I don't know how else to explain it.
It doesn't make much sense at all. But given what you just mentioned, growing political instability, you can put economic instability there as well, with the UK, France, and Germany as these main three powers, and also the growing fierce rhetoric between Hungary, Poland, possible, as we discussed, using force and sabotage against each other. What do you see the future now of NATO and the EU? We talked about this in the past. You were kind of pessimistic about their future, but things seems to be going from bad to worse. Do you see any unraveling of either of those two organizations?
Well, in January of 2022, in an interview with the National Interest that Dimitri Simes conducted, and I think George Beebe was part of that, who used to be on the Russia desk in the CIA, I said that not only would the Russians invade, which they did, but I said ultimately NATO will not survive this crisis. And I don't think it will. Look, we talked about the contradictions with President Trump. On the one hand, President Trump showed every reason to cooperate with Russia. He enunciated these things. He enumerated these things. There are good reasons for us to work with Russia. He walked up to the edge, but he wouldn't cross the line to cooperation, and he blamed that on the fact that his European allies didn't support it. And since then, he's taken a position, well, I'll be hard on Russia. Russia won't cooperate, so we'll find ways to pressure Russia. But at the same time, he's largely walked away from his position as the head of NATO and returned to the Western Hemisphere now to open a new front against Venezuela, which could expand into all sorts of things, as we've discussed. At the same time, he's declaring peace has broken out in perpetuity in the Middle East when there's no real evidence for that. So this is a very confused picture, and we keep looking for some rationality in all of this. And quite frankly, I don't think there is any. I think everything's impulse driven. Everything is short term in its focus. The problem for us is the Russians are long-term strategic thinkers. And that's why they wanted a long-term strategic arrangement. So they're going to continue on their road, and nothing we do is going to derail that. And if we try to derail it militarily, we'll find ourselves at war with Russia. I think President Trump knows that and will avoid it. And that's back to the tomahawk business. But he also knows that we're not as strong as we once were. He won't admit that. He keeps talking about we're the most powerful nation in the world, because that by definition or implication makes him the most powerful man in the world, and he likes that. But that's a lot of malarkey. That's not true. We're a very powerful country, but there are limits to our power. He's never really wanted to admit those. But when he said, I don't think we're going to send those tomahawks, and talked about the missile stocks in the United States, how much do we have and how much do we need, he was admitting there are limitations to our military power, at least insofar as a war with Russia is concerned. That's a good thing. It doesn't help the situation in Europe. But it's an abdication of his responsibility as the leader of NATO to simply walk away and say, I'll up sanctions, I'll punish Russia, but I'm not going to do anything else. All he's done is pour more oil onto the fire and make matters worse. He hasn't contributed in the least to a cessation of hostilities.
Yeah, it seems as if I mean, he almost sold it during his campaign that his goal was to walk back away from the empire to strengthen the republic instead, something which would have been, well, people supported him on. But then he kind of shifted a bit. Now he's arguing that the reason for America's decline is weak leaders, and the salvation is, well, that's me, the strong leader. But the problem then is what happens if the strength is the sole solution to regaining the former strength, and it doesn't work. As you said, there's limits on US power. Then it's yeah, that makes him look weak as well, and that makes him more reckless. And no, it's just I feel like we're going in a very unpredictable direction, because it's not just with the Russians he can't get through with, it's also the Chinese. They won't back off and bow to his sanctions. So even the Iranians aren't gonna back down. The Indians either. I mean, it works on the Europeans because I guess for us, we can't imagine a world where we don't live in America's basement. But for independent powers, they don't go through with this. So it's unclear where Trump is going to take it from here. So I guess as a final question, do you see any? What do you have anything seeing in your crystal ball, or what do you expect going forward?
Well, you have to look at President Trump's actions as opposed to what he says. He has now begun campaigning for the re-election of Lindsey Graham, the senator from South Carolina, who is probably the most vocal warmonger on the Hill, is the prisoner of the Israeli lobby and the prisoner of the defense lobby and the war machine. He's bound up with those things. And that's where Trump wants to put emphasis. He wants to ensure that Lindsey Graham is reelected. At the same time, he's effectively declared war on Senator Rand Paul of Kentucky and Congressman Thomas Massie from Kentucky, both of whom have criticized the use of money on the Hill by the Israel lobby to promote war in the Middle East, both of whom have been opposed to our interventions in the Middle East, our potential involvement in the war with Russia, and are openly critical of this developing war with Venezuela and what they rightly characterized as illegal behavior at sea, essentially destroying boats left and right, which is against international law. These are extrajudicial killings. So those are the people that he's trying to destroy, Senator Paul, Mr. Massie, and he's going to work hard to reelect Lindsey Graham. What does that tell you? Where is his heart? What does he think? Well, he's with Lindsey Graham. And that bodes evil for the United States. There's no question about it.
If anyone wanted to create a lot of insecurity, economic decline, and suck the soul out of the country, that would be the prime candidate, I guess.
Yes,
Well,
that's right.
well, thank you so much for taking the time. I wish you could have finished on a
you'd thank me
more
for anything
positive
this morning.
note. This is
I guess the answer is a friend of mine says all the time to me, he said, Doug, drink heavily. It's the only answer. I'm not a drinker, so I don't do that. But he has a point that sometimes it just looks hopeless, but we'll see.
well, it does seem that we're, at least in Europe, moving closer and closer to a direct war. The willingness to take great risks seem to increase, even though at the same time the United States seem to be pulling back and saying the Europeans should take care of their own war. So it's we're kind of losing our backup at the same time as we're escalating. So I think at some point the Russian calculation of the cost of not doing something will be higher than the cost of actually doing something. And I think we're getting very, very close to this. And the fact that the Russians are building up Oreshnik arsenals now is causing some concern. So, anyways, it's hard to finish on a positive note given where we are today. But yeah, such is the world. So thank you, anyways.
Okay, thank you, Glenn.
Bye.
Bye-bye.